Hey guys, tonight's history lesson has too much moaning to be boring, I promise. Forget what you've seen in Hollywood, where medieval knights were noble and princesses always ended up with a chaste kiss. That's pure, unadulterated pap. The reality was a squalid, sweaty, often horrifying mess of desires and desperation, where sex was rarely about romance, and almost always about power, property, or pure, unadulterated filth. We're going to crawl through the Dark Ages, slosh through the Renaissance, and maybe even get a little bit medieval on some of your cherished illusions about our ancestors' bedroom antics. Prepare for a deep dive into the truly uncomfortable, the truly grotesque, and the things that make you thankful for modern plumbing and, consent. Let me know what shocked you most by the end of this twisted tour, assuming you don't choke on your own revulsion first. Imagine being a noblewoman expected to bleed on cue, not from a wound, but to prove your worth, your fertility, your very ability to continue a bloodline that was probably already too thin and too prone to disease. They called it holy, this obsession with procreation, but it frequently involved things far less holy and far more humiliating than any devout prayer. We're talking forced hymenal inspections, performed by leering priests or overbearing matriarchs, sometimes even by male relatives who had the right to ensure the purity of their lineage. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was an invasion, a public stripping of dignity, a brutal assertion of control over a woman's body from the moment she could possibly conceive until her womb shriveled to nothing. The pressure throbbed, a constant, ugly ache in the background of their lives. A woman's entire existence revolved around her ability to produce an heir, preferably male, and failing that, to at least not shame her family with barrenness or, God forbid, a public display of lust. The shame was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she couldn't shed, even in the privacy of her own bedchamber, which often wasn't private at all. Consider the notion of conjugal rights, a delightful phrase that basically meant a man owned his wife's body as much as he owned his oxen. She had no say, no choice, no agency. He demanded, she supplied. Simple as that. Refusal could lead to beatings, public shaming, or worse. The church, ever helpful, reinforced this grotesque power dynamic, portraying women as the weaker sex, inherently sinful and perpetually tempting men to fall from grace. So, any lust felt by the man? Blame the woman. Any transgression? Her fault. It was a vicious cycle, a theological straitjacket wrapped around the biological imperative. And speaking of biological imperatives, hygiene was an absolute joke. People rarely bathed, if at all. Their bodies oozed sweat and grime, their teeth rotted, their breath could strip paint. Imagine the smell, the rank odor of unwashed skin, stale urine, and festering wounds, all mingling in cramped, unventilated spaces. This was the backdrop to all acts of intimacy, a truly sensory overload of the foulest kind. And then there was the plague, a truly grim reaper that stalked every city and village, turning everyone into a walking corpse. Death was everywhere, a constant, chilling presence that warped perspectives on life, on love, on sex. Why bother with propriety when you might be dead tomorrow? Why hold back on desire when life was so short, so brutal? This led to some truly depraved acts, a desperate grabbing for fleeting pleasure in the face of utter annihilation. Prostitutes, already a marginalized group, became even more desperate, offering their bodies for meager sums, often succumbing to the very diseases they were supposed to be protected from. The streets crawled with the sick, the dying, and those looking for a quick fix, a momentary escape from the horror. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror, the constant threat of agonizing death, hanging over every embrace, every whispered promise, every desperate plea. This was not the stuff of ballads and chivalry, but of raw, primal survival. But it wasn't just about survival, it was about power, always about power. The medieval castle, supposedly a bastion of strength and order, was often a hotbed of intrigue, betrayal, and sexual exploitation. Lords exercised droit du seigneur, the supposed right of the Lord, to deflower any virgin in his domain on her wedding night. While historians debate the widespread practice of this particular horror, the idea of it, the chilling implication of a lord's absolute power over the bodies of his subjects, speaks volumes. It was a tool of intimidation, a constant reminder of who truly held the reins of authority, of who could take what they wanted, whenever they wanted it. The mere threat was enough to instill fear and enforce obedience, a blunt instrument of control, wielded with callous disregard for dignity or emotion. Imagine the young bride, her heart thumping with a mix of fear and naive hope for her future, only to have it crushed under the heavy boot of feudal dominance. Her purity, a celebrated virtue, instantly smeared not by choice, but by decree. The Church, while preaching abstinence and chastity, was often deeply entangled in its own sordid affairs. Monasteries and convents, supposedly havens of spiritual devotion, were sometimes dens of secret trysts, illegitimate children, and rampant hypocrisy. Monks and nuns, sworn to celibacy, often found ways to circumvent their vows, leading to hushed scandals and desperate attempts to conceal the evidence. The hypocrisy was a stench, even then, polluting the very notion of spiritual purity. Confessionals, meant for absolution, became opportunities for priests to probe into the most intimate details of their parishioners' lives, sometimes crossing lines into something far more predatory. The power imbalance was staggering, the spiritual authority wielding immense psychological leverage over vulnerable souls seeking solace or salvation. It was a cynical game, played by those who claimed moral superiority, a demonstration of how easily power corrupts, even, or especially, when cloaked in sanctity. The pious words were just a thin veneer over a throb of lust and control. And let's not forget the sheer brutality of childbirth. No sterile hospitals, no pain relief, just screaming, sweating, and often death. A woman's life was constantly at risk, her body a battleground where new life fought for existence against overwhelming odds. Many women died in childbirth, leaving behind fatherless children and desolate husbands. Those who survived often suffered lifelong injuries, chronic pain, and a constant fear of the next pregnancy. The trauma of birth was a fundamental part of the female experience, a gruesome reality that shaped their relationships, their fears, and their resignation. This constant dance with death, this intimate knowledge of pain and suffering, undoubtedly shaped how they viewed intimacy itself. Was it a blessing or a curse, a duty or a moment of fleeting pleasure? More often, it was simply a dangerous obligation, a roll of the dice with their very lives on the line. The blood and sweat of labor often marked the beginning of life, but just as often, the end. The concept of love, as we understand it today, was largely absent from the medieval lexicon of marriage. Marriages were contracts, alliances, exchanges of property and power. Daughters were pawns, traded between families to secure land, titles, or political influence. Their feelings, their desires, their very humanity were irrelevant. They were chattel, objects to be bartered and bred. The idea of marrying for love was a dangerous, radical notion, often leading to scandal and ruin. Emotional consequences? Who cared? As long as the lineage continued, as long as the coffers were full, the rest was just inconvenient noise. This transactional view of relationships created a sterile, brutal environment for intimacy, where genuine connection was rare and often accidental. It was a system designed to perpetuate status, not happiness, to consolidate wealth, not affection. The throb of passion was irrelevant, replaced by the cold calculus of the family ledger. Consider the grotesque irony of courtly love, where knights supposedly adored their ladies from afar, engaging in chaste admiration and poetic devotion. This was largely a performance, a social construct designed to sublimate desires that couldn't be expressed openly. Underneath the flowery verses and grand gestures often lay a simmering cauldron of repressed lust, unfulfilled desires, and unspoken frustrations. And when it did break through, it often resulted in clandestine affairs, secret rendezvous, and the ever-present threat of exposure and public shame. The scandal, the whispers, the potential for ruin all added a layer of dangerous excitement, a thrill that was perhaps more potent than genuine affection. The elaborate rituals of courtly love were just another way to control and channel dangerous human urges, to provide an outlet without truly disrupting the rigid social order. It was a beautiful lie, a shimmering illusion over a very ugly truth. The medieval worldview was permeated by superstition and fear. Demons lurked in the shadows, witches cast evil spells, and the devil himself was a constant threat, often believed to exploit human weaknesses, especially sexual ones. This fear dictated much of everyday life, including intimate relations. Sex was often seen as inherently sinful, a necessary evil for procreation, but otherwise a gateway to damnation. This created a climate of profound guilt and repression, where natural desires were warped into sources of anxiety and self-loathing. The fear of eternal damnation often overshadowed any fleeting pleasure, turning intimacy into a moral minefield. Confessors would grill parishioners on their sexual thoughts, their dreams, their very desires, seeking out any hint of a pact with the devil or a fall from grace. The spiritual chokehold on human sexuality was immense, turning acts of physical connection into a terrifying gamble with one's immortal soul. The shame associated with the body, with desire, was a powerful, insidious weapon. Moving slightly forward in time, the Renaissance, with its supposed rebirth of art and philosophy, hardly made things better on the intimacy front. For the wealthy, it simply meant more elaborate ways to indulge their appetites, often with a veneer of artistic or intellectual justification. Think of the Borgias, a family so synonymous with corruption and incest that they've become a byword for historical depravity. Their story is a twisted tapestry of power, poison, and pervasive sexual misconduct, woven with threads of Machiavellian political maneuvering. Pope Alexander VI, the Patriarch, openly fathered multiple children, showering them with titles and wealth, blurring the lines between sacred and profane to an almost farcical degree. His daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, became the subject of lurid rumors regarding incestuous relations with her father and brothers, whispers that clung to her like a foul scent, whether true or not. The mere existence of such tales, believed by many, speaks volumes about the moral landscape. This was not a period of newfound sexual liberation, but often one of heightened, almost theatrical, hypocrisy, where debauchery was simply conducted with more flourish and less discretion, especially at the highest echelons of power. The rank scent of their ambition was only matched by the stench of their indiscretions. The lust was palpable, the power absolute, and the consequences often fatal. The wealthy also employed servants, whose duties often extended far beyond the domestic, blurring into sexual availability. These were not relationships of choice or affection, but of economic necessity and systemic exploitation. A young woman might find herself trading her body for a roof over her head and a meager wage, trapped in a cycle of dependency. Her shame was her own, her vulnerability a constant threat. This was a grim reality, a shadow cast over the gilded halls of Renaissance palaces. The pretense of service simply masked a pervasive system of sexual exploitation, where the powerful could indulge their whims with little to no consequence, and the vulnerable had no recourse. The power flowed one way, an invisible chain binding them to their masters. Their bodies just another commodity to be used and discarded. The quiet suffering of these individuals rarely made it into the annals of history, but it was a constant, throbbing wound in the underbelly of society. Let's talk about the Kama Sutra, often mistakenly viewed as some ancient Indian sex manual, promoting boundless pleasure. While it certainly contains detailed descriptions of various sexual positions and techniques, it's far more than just a naughty book. It's a treatise on the art of living well, encompassing social etiquette, philosophy, and the pursuit of dharma, artha, and kama, virtue, prosperity, and pleasure. And yes, it describes sex, but often within highly codified social structures, with specific rules for courtship, marriage, and even interactions with courtesans. It was a reflection of a society with its own rigid hierarchies and expectations, where certain acts were appropriate for certain castes or situations, and others were not. So, while it explored desire, it did so within a framework that was anything but universally liberated. The focus wasn't just on primal urges, but on a cultivated sensuality, an intellectualized approach to pleasure, all while maintaining a complex social order. It oozed with a certain detachment, a clinical exploration of human interaction, rather than a passionate embrace of unbridled lust. Consider the role of eunuchs in many ancient and medieval courts, particularly in the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. Their emasculation was a brutal act of control, designed to ensure their loyalty and prevent them from siring rivals to the throne or sullying the imperial bloodline. Yet, paradoxically, they often wielded immense power, becoming trusted advisors, guardians of harems, and key administrators. Their existence was a living testament to the lengths to which power structures would go to maintain control, even at the cost of a person's very essence. The removal of their manhood was meant to make them safe, to remove the threat of lust or procreation. Yet it often transformed them into formidable political players, operating in the shadows, their sterile bodies a stark contrast to the fertile chaos of the court. They moved like silent specters, their missing parts a chilling reminder of the brutal requirements of status and obedience. They watched, they listened, and they pulled strings, their lack of a throb allowing them a cold, calculating detachment. The medieval approach to medicine, especially anything related to the body's inner workings, was pure quackery, often intertwined with bizarre religious beliefs. When it came to sexual health, ignorance was rampant. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other venereal diseases were devastating scourges, often misdiagnosed, mistreated, or simply attributed to divine punishment for sin. Treatments involved everything from mercury rubs, poisonous, to leeching gross and ineffective, to praying for divine intervention. Imagine the constant fear, the agonizing symptoms, the physical deformation, and the social stigma that came with contracting such a disease. It was a death sentence for some, a life sentence of pain and shame for others. The idea of contraception was rudimentary at best, often involving ineffective herbal remedies or even magical charms. Abortion was a desperate, dangerous gamble, usually performed in secrecy with horrific outcomes. So, every sexual encounter was a roll of the dice, not just with reputation or eternal damnation, but with excruciating physical decay and death. The body would ooze, rot, and crawl with sickness, a horrifying consequence of an act considered both necessary and sinful. The concept of public shaming was a powerful tool for social control, especially when it came to sexual transgressions. Adulterous women might be paraded through the streets, their heads shaven, their faces smeared with tar, enduring the jeers and rotten vegetables of the crowd. Their shame was not just personal, but a spectacle, a public warning to others. Men, while often escaping harsher punishment for similar acts, still faced social censure, loss of reputation, or financial penalties. These punishments were designed to inflict maximum psychological humiliation, to break the spirit, and to ensure conformity. The body, once a vessel of desire, became a canvas for public condemnation, a living example of what happened when you dared to step outside the prescribed lines of morality. The public exposure was brutal, the shame a brand burned into the soul. This wasn't about justice, but about enforcing a rigid moral code through fear and degradation. A cynical performance designed to maintain social order. The crowd would moan their judgment, their collective disgust a palpable thing. Even the simple act of courtship was fraught with peril and expectation, a dance of veiled intentions and hidden agendas. For women, especially, virginity was a commodity, a fragile treasure to be guarded fiercely until marriage. Loss of it outside wedlock meant ruin, disgrace, and a life of social ostracization. For men, proving their virility and securing an heir was paramount. This intense pressure often led to desperate measures, to deceit, to manipulation, to premarital sex conducted in secrecy and fear. The thrill of illicit passion was always accompanied by the cold dread of discovery, of public exposure, of irreversible shame. The stakes were incredibly high, turning what should be a tender exploration of connection into a tense, dangerous negotiation. The very act of desire was tainted by the oppressive weight of societal expectations and the constant threat of public humiliation. It was a suffocating pressure, a constant choke on genuine intimacy. The monastic orders, while claiming to be separate from the world, were still very much a part of it, especially economically. Wealthy families would donate children to monasteries or convents, not always out of religious devotion, but to secure their salvation, dispose of unwanted offspring, or secure alliances. These children, often sent at a young age, had their lives irrevocably altered, their natural urges and desires suppressed by rigid religious dogma. Imagine the internal conflict, the raw, throbbing urges of adolescence, colliding with vows of celibacy and a life of austere devotion. Some undoubtedly found genuine spiritual fulfillment, but many must have suffered in silence, their bodies and minds at war, their lives a perpetual struggle against their own humanity. The pious exterior often masked a deep current of human suffering, a quiet desperation born of forced repression. The walls of the monastery might have kept the world out, but they couldn't always keep the desires in. The use of love potions and charms was widespread, a testament to the desperate desire for control over unpredictable human emotions. These concoctions, often made from dubious ingredients and imbued with superstitious beliefs, were attempts to force affection, to compel someone to desire another against their will. They were, in essence, an early form of emotional manipulation, a desperate attempt to bypass genuine connection and simply invoke lust or devotion. These were dangerous games, often ending in disillusionment, betrayal, or even poisoning. The belief in their efficacy highlights the raw desperation, the almost pathetic hope that magic could solve the messy problem of human desire. It was a cynical reflection of a world where genuine affection was often secondary to strategic alliances or forced compliance, where hearts were not won but conjured. The desire to control, to command affection, was a powerful, dark current. And let's not forget the sheer physical discomfort of medieval life that permeated everything, including intimacy. No central heating, rough woolen clothes that itched, constant infestations of fleas and lice, poor sanitation. Beds were often straw-filled, shared by multiple family members, and rarely cleaned. The smell of unwashed bodies, stale urine, and open sewers was pervasive. Imagine trying to experience anything resembling intimacy in such conditions, surrounded by the rank odor of disease and decay, itching incessantly, constantly aware of the dirt and grim. It was a world where sensuality was often drowned out by sensory overload of the most unpleasant kind. The idealization of historical romance vanishes the moment you consider the persistent bodily fluids, the constant itch, the pervasive stench. It was not a world of soft kisses and gentle caresses, but of rough fabrics, pungent smells, and the constant awareness of bodily functions. The sweat would mingle, the smells would rise, and the overall experience was often a gritty, uncomfortable reality. The justice system, when it even existed, was often brutal and arbitrary, especially for women accused of sexual misconduct. A woman accused of adultery or fornication could face severe public punishment, even death, while her male counterpart might escape with a mere fine or a slap on the wrist. The double standard was blatant, a stark demonstration of how power dynamics were baked into the very fabric of society. Women were held to an impossibly high standard of purity, their reputation fragile and easily shattered. A single rumor, a whispered accusation, could destroy a life, regardless of its truth. This created a climate of fear and paranoia, where women were constantly on guard, forced to navigate a treacherous social landscape where their every move, their every interaction, could be scrutinized and condemned. Their bodies, their desires, their very existence, were under constant surveillance, subject to the arbitrary judgment of men. The threat of public exposure hung heavy, a perpetual shadow. The practice of wet nursing, where aristocratic women would send their infants to be nursed by peasant women, highlights another cynical aspect of medieval life. While ostensibly about infant health, it was also a way for noble women to quickly resume their wifely duties of conceiving more children, freeing them from the inconvenient and time-consuming demands of breastfeeding. It also severed the intense bond between mother and child, fostering a detachment that reflected the transactional nature of family life among the elite. The peasant wet nurse, meanwhile, was often exploited, her own child potentially suffering neglect while she nursed another's for meager compensation. This was not a choice for her, but a necessity, a brutal economic reality that forced her to prioritize another woman's child over her own. It was a cycle of exploitation, reflecting how even the most intimate acts of care were twisted by the relentless pursuit of status and wealth. The natural bond was sacrificed for the cold calculus of lineage and convenience. So when you see those glittering images of medieval romance, remember the stench, remember the disease, remember the brutal power dynamics, the pervasive fear, the constant threat of shame and public degradation. Remember that love was often a luxury few could afford, and sex was more often about duty, property, or plain exploitation. The past was not some idyllic wonderland of chivalry and chaste kisses. It was a grimy, painful, and often horrifying place where desire throbbed under a mountain of societal oppression and religious dogma. It was a world where every act of intimacy was tangled up in complex webs of power, survival, and often profound misery. The human body, in all its messy reality, was a battleground, a source of both fleeting pleasure and enduring torment, a vessel of lust and a canvas for shame. The cycles just continued endlessly, a bleak and undeniable testament to human nature's enduring flaws, a perpetual crawl through the muck of desire and despair.